What could kill an entire street in just 72 hours without leaving a single trace? No smell, no color, no warning. And no one understood what was happening until one man asked the question no one else thought to pose. Where do you get your water? Early morning, London, 1854. Fog still clings to the damp, cold brick walls. The cobblestone streets reflect the faint light of dawn. A man opens his bakery. He has done this every day on time for over 20 years. Nothing has changed. Nothing is out of the ordinary. The oven begins to glow. Dough is kneaded. The air gradually warms with the scent of fresh-baked bread. Outside, the street slowly wakes up. A cart pusher passes by. A woman sweeps her doorstep. A child runs past, laughing, then vanishes into the mist. Life goes on, as it always has. But only a few hours later, that man has to stop. Not because of fatigue, not because of hunger. A sudden pain seizes his abdomen, doubling him over right in the middle of his shop. He tries to stand. He cannot. His hands grip the table, trembling. Cold sweat pours down his forehead. Outside, the street remains noisy. No one knows. By afternoon, the shop is still open. But no one is standing behind the counter. By nightfall, a dead cart pulls up to the door. There are no screams, no crowds, just one more name, vanished from this street. And he was not the only case. That same day, other doors began to close. One house, then two, then three. No one called it an outbreak, because no one understood what it was. There was no blood, no smoke, no obvious signs. It was just that people disappeared. The next morning, the street was a bit quieter. Not because it was empty, but because those who remained began to fear. Yet they still did one thing, something they had done for years. They stepped out of their houses, they walked to the corner, and they drew water from the familiar pump. The water was clear, cold, perfect. And they had no idea that very thing was killing them. If you want to see how the most modern city in the world was brought to its knees by something invisible, subscribe to the channel, because this story has only just begun. In just a few days, this street will never be the same again. And the only question remaining is, why did no one realize it sooner? Those deaths did not occur in some backward place, but in London, 1854, the center of the world's power, where humanity believed they had mastered nature. The city operated like a massive machine. Steamships moved cargo constantly. The telegraph transmitted news faster than any previous means. And millions lived packed into a system they believed was the most modern ever to exist. But inside that very system, a lethal mistake was silently lurking. If you left the wealthy neighborhoods and stepped into Soho, you would immediately understand why people believed death came from the environment. The air here was thick, heavy, and hard to breathe, as if you were inhaling something that shouldn't exist. The stench didn't come from a single source. It was a concoction of human and animal waste, trash and decaying matter that no one bothered to clear. The narrow streets trapped it all, giving it no escape. Underfoot, raw sewage flowed openly, winding through the cracks in the stones and evaporating under the summer heat, creating a layer of air that everyone believed was toxic. And that belief wasn't baseless. The filthiest neighborhoods often had the most deaths. Places with less odor were safer. Everything seemed to fit perfectly. So when the deaths began to spread, no one panicked immediately. They thought they understood what was happening. They shuttered their windows to avoid the miasma, bad air. They burned herbs to drive away the smell. They avoided the foulest smelling streets. And they believed that would be enough. But what makes this story terrifying is that all of it was logical. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing made people stop and doubt. And that is why, as the death toll began to rise day by day, the entire street kept looking in the same direction, at the stench, the air, the visible and smellable filth, without ever realizing that the thing actually killing them was nowhere near any of those things. At first, no one called it a disaster. It appeared scattered and isolated, much like what London had always endured. A person suddenly fell ill after a meal. Another was bedridden in just a few hours. A door closed earlier than usual. No one connected the dots because there was no reason to. This city always had disease. It always had death. But then, the pace began to shift. It was no longer individual cases. On the same morning, many people began to collapse almost simultaneously. Those who were healthy a few hours prior could no longer stand by noon. They clutched their stomachs, doubled over their breath, coming in gasps, as if their insides were being throttled by something invisible. By afternoon, the condition grew worse. Constant, uncontrollable vomiting. Their bodies dehydrated so rapidly that their faces changed in mere hours. Skin turned pale, eyes became sunken, lips cracked and dry. Witnesses began to panic, not because they understood what was happening, but because they didn't. This was unlike any illness they had ever seen. It didn't linger. It didn't give the body time to fight back. It came fast, attacked violently, and ended before you could adapt. People who were still talking in the morning were dead before dark. And then, the street began to change in a way everyone could feel, but no one dared to voice. The sound vanished. The familiar noises, carts' voices, calling out, doors opening, were gradually replaced by abnormally long silences, not because the people were gone, but because they were waiting to see who would be next. Families began to leave in silence, carrying what they could. No goodbyes, no explanations. They just disappeared. But not everyone could go. The elderly, the sick, those with no money, stayed behind, trapped in a place where every passing hour saw more people fall. And the most terrifying part was that there was no clear pattern. It wasn't just the poor who died. It wasn't just those in filthy houses. There were clean homes where people still died. There were careful people who still couldn't avoid it. That caused the fear to spread faster than the disease itself. Because if there is no rule, there is no way to escape. Through it all, life continued in a strange way. People still left their houses in the morning, still walked the familiar streets, still did the things they had done hundreds of times before. They tried to cling to normalcy as a way to reassure themselves that everything would be okay. But in reality, it wasn't. Each passing day, the number of those who vanished grew. And what made it haunting wasn't the death itself, but the fact that no one could point to where it came from. No trace, no clear origin, no specific thing to blame. Only a vague sense that something was very close, weaving through every house, every street, picking its next victim with no way to predict it. And it was that invisibility that truly caused the entire street to collapse. When the death toll rose to an undeniable level, fear began to turn into action. But it wasn't organized action. It was a series of frantic, disjointed, and desperate reactions. People changed their way of life overnight. Some stopped eating familiar foods, thinking the food was tainted. Some kept their doors locked all day, avoiding contact with anyone. Once crowded streets began to show gaps, not because everyone had vanished, but because they were trying to avoid one another. Suspicion spread faster than the disease. Anyone could be a source of danger. Anything could be the cause. And when humans don't know what specifically to fear, they start to fear everything. Doctors were now forced to take more aggressive action. They began checking everything they suspected, from dust in the homes and trash in the streets, to the mud accumulating at the base of walls. They entered every house where someone had died, observing, recording, comparing. But the problem was, everything was filthy. Nothing stood out more than the rest. Nothing was clear enough to be the sole cause. When they found no answers in the environment, they turned to something more grisly, the human body itself. Bodies of the recently deceased were examined the very same day. They were opened up, searched for signs in hopes of finding an anomaly. But inside, there were no clear answers, no wounds, no specific signs to explain why a healthy person in the morning was dead before nightfall. This left them in a dangerous state. They had many theories, but not a single truth. And everything they checked, the dust, the trash, the air, the corpses, was only a small part of countless possibilities. Meanwhile, the residents began to look at the doctors with a sense of unease. The people who were supposed to know best were now unable to give a certain answer. But instead of stopping and asking a different question, the whole neighborhood continued to cling to what they believed was true. They continued to avoid, continued to change, continued to seek the cause in visible things. And that created a dangerous paradox. They were in constant motion, but getting no closer to the truth. The death toll did not drop. It did not slow down, and that began to reveal something no one wanted to admit. Something in the way they understood this disease was wrong. But no one knew where the error lay. No one dared to break the belief that had existed for so long. Because if that belief collapsed, they would have nothing left to hold on to. And in a place where death could come in just a few hours, not knowing what to believe was more terrifying than death itself. So they kept believing, kept searching, kept looking in every direction, except the right one. And it was in that moment, when an entire community was looking the wrong way, that the most important question had still never been asked. Amidst the chaos consuming the neighborhood, there was one man who did not act like the others. He did not flee. He did not burn herbs. He did not hide. And most importantly, he did not look at what everyone else was looking at. His name was John Snow. Not a prominent name at the time. Not a man who appeared in the newspapers. Not a man of power in the medical establishment. But he had one thing most people lacked: doubt. Not doubt of the fear, but doubt of the way people understood it. When reports of deaths began to appear densely around Broad Street, Snow did not rush to a conclusion. He did not immediately accept the existing explanation. Instead, he did something simple, yet something no one else was doing. He went outside. He began knocking on every door. Not to treat the sick, not to offer advice, but to ask. The questions were repetitive, simple, almost mundane. Who in the house had fallen ill? When? How long had they lived there? And one question no one else posed: where did they get their water every day? The people answered, wearily, mechanically. They had just lost loved ones. They didn't care about an investigation, but Snow did. He recorded everything. Not a single detail was missed. Every answer, every address, every name was entered into his notebook. And every evening, he returned home and opened a map of the neighborhood. He didn't draw the roads, he drew death. Each death was marked with a small stroke. At first, those strokes were scattered with no clear pattern. But as more data was added, a shape began to emerge. The marks were not distributed randomly. They didn't follow the wind. They didn't cluster in the filthiest places. They were gathering from different streets, from different families, all of them gradually converging on a single point. Snow looked at that map in silence. He didn't need more proof to know he was seeing what no one else saw. But he checked again anyway. The outliers. A place with many people, but almost no deaths. Why? He went there, and he realized they didn't use what the others used. Another group living right in the middle of the hardest hit area. But they were unaffected. Why? The answer was the same. It wasn't because they were lucky. It was because they weren't exposed to the same thing. At this point, everything began to clarify in a chilling way. It wasn't a hypothesis. It wasn't speculation. It was a pattern, an undeniable logic. But the problem was, it went against everything everyone believed. If he was right, then the entire way this city understood disease was wrong. And that meant he didn't just have to prove a cause. He had to fight an entire belief system. Snow closed his notebook. He had enough data, but data isn't enough to change the world. He needed a decision, an action. And to achieve that, he had to convince people who didn't want to be proven wrong. Meanwhile, out there, the death toll continued to rise. And with every passing hour, another family vanished, never knowing that the answer had been right in front of them all along. John Snow had no army, no power, no one behind him. The only thing he had was a notebook and a conclusion that most people would not want to hear. But he knew he was out of time. Every day that passed, his map grew thicker with strokes. Not data, people. Names that had just vanished from that street in only a few hours. And if he slowed down, dozens more would follow. So he took everything he had to the local board, the people with the power to decide. The room was not noisy. There was no grand argument at first, only skepticism. Snow presented what he had seen, the clusters of cases, the concentration points, the exceptions. He didn't say much. He didn't try to persuade with emotion. He offered only one thing: a pattern, a repetition that could not be a coincidence. But the problem was, what he said didn't fit what they had believed for years. The people sitting in that room were not ignorant. They were educated, experienced men of standing, and they had built their entire understanding on a different explanation. If they accepted that Snow was right, it meant admitting they had been wrong. The silence stretched on. No one wanted to be the first to nod. No one wanted to take responsibility for a decision that went against everything they knew. But outside, death did not wait for them to reach a consensus. It continued, every hour, every day. And it was that very pressure that forced them to do something they weren't sure of act, even if they didn't fully believe. The next morning, a workman was summoned. There was no grand announcement, no gathering crowd. No one on that street knew what was about to happen. The workman walked to the corner of Broad Street, where the familiar pump still stood as it did every day. People still walked by, still carried their jars and buckets waiting their turn. No one stopped. No one suspected. The workman placed his tools on the pump handle. He tightened, and he turned. The sound of metal echoed very faintly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just that the pump handle was removed. From that moment on, no one could use it anymore. And then, something began to change. The cases gradually declined. Not fast enough to make people believe immediately, but clearly enough that it couldn't be denied. The street began to breathe again. Doors no longer stayed shuttered constantly. The dead carts no longer appeared as frequently as before. Something had stopped. But right then, another question surfaced. If it wasn't the air, then what was it? For the first time, attention began to shift. People went back to check the one thing they had never doubted before. Water from the pump was drawn and observed more closely. But it remained the same, clear, odorless, with nothing unusual to the naked eye. There were no microscopes powerful enough, no knowledge of bacteria, no way to see what actually existed inside. And that was the paradox. They were standing right in front of the answer, but lacked the tools to recognize it. So to many, all that had just happened was still just a coincidence, a lucky decision, a right action, for the wrong reason. But for Snow, it was enough. He didn't need to see it. He didn't need to prove it with his eyes. The pattern was right, and that was enough to act. Only a few years later, London was forced to face the consequences of its own outdated system. In 1858, the heat caused the stench from the River Thames to rise across the city, reaching the very halls of power. Parliament could not work. The city could not ignore it. And this time, they were forced to change. A modern sewer system was built. Not because they fully understood everything, but because they could no longer continue living as they had. Just 4 years after the cholera outbreak, London would experience a summer where the city's own stench nearly suffocated it, an event history calls the Great Stink. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode.